Good morning. Thank you for joining the Christian-Muslim Dialogue of Lexington, Kentucky. My name is Addison Hosier, chair of the steering committee. Our group's been together for 23 years, working to provide a space for interfaith dialogue to occur in a respectful and understanding way. The Reverend Dr. Leah Schade should be a familiar face to you. In September 2019, she spoke to us about her book, Preaching in the Purple Zone, Ministry in the Red-Blue Divide. She is an associate professor of preaching and worship at Lexington Theological Seminary here in Lexington. She's an ordained Lutheran minister since 2000 and has served congregations in rural, urban, and suburban settings. She's an accomplished musician and has served as an anti-fracking and a climate activist, community organizer, and advocate for environmental justice issues, which is what brings her here today. Dr. Schade, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Addison, and thank you to the Christian-Muslim Dialogue group. It's great to be back with you all, and I appreciate the invitation. Last time I talked with you about the purple zone, and this time I've been invited to talk about the green zone. So I am going to share with you a little bit of background about how I became involved in environmental activism. I'm going to share a little bit about some of the interfaith work that I've done along those lines. And I'm going to share with you some research that I've done around how Christian ministers are addressing environmental issues in their preaching. And also going to share about a resource that I'm working on developing with a rabbi in Jerusalem, and an eco-preacher resource. And then if we have time, I'll see how long our discussion goes, but I'd also like to share with you some of the work I've been doing with my students at Lexington Theological Seminary, helping them to understand some of the complexities specifically around Appalachia and Eastern Kentucky and the environmental and political things that are happening there. So those are the things that I'll hope to cover in our time together. There will be times when I'll pause and say and ask if there are questions that anyone has. So that'll be sort of distributed through my time with you here. My talk today is entitled Creation, Climate, and Congregations, Healing Our Vitamin C, as in creation, deficiency. As Addison shared with you, I teach at Lexington Theological Seminary. I've been ordained in the Lutheran Church since 2000. And here are some of the books that I've written, 3 of which are around environmental issues, and I'm going to talk specifically about one of them with you today. And I also am the Eco-Preacher blogger at Patheos, and you can follow me there and keep up with my writings, that what I consider my public theology. I grew up in York, Pennsylvania, and I was a pastor at Reformation Lutheran Church in Media, which is a suburb of Philadelphia. I also served a church called Spirit and Truth Worship Center in Yeadon. And the last church that I served on a full-time basis was United in Christ Lutheran Church in Lewisburg. All 3 of these settings taught me something about what it means to be at the intersection of environmental issues and the church. So Reformation was a suburban, mostly white congregation. Spirit and Truth was a more urban and African American and African Native congregation. And United in Christ was a rural, small town congregation, primarily white, very, moderate to conservative. And so preaching about environmental issues in these three settings was very different because they all had different experiences and different ideas, different political orientations, and they taught me a lot. I first became publicly involved in environmental issues in 2011, so more than a decade ago, when I was asked to testify at the one of the public hearings on mercury emissions for coal-fired power plants. And then I was asked to go, that was in Philadelphia, and then I was asked to do the same in Washington, D.C. And this was important work that environmental activists were doing on an interfaith basis, asking for there to be regulations on mercury emissions from coal-fired power plants so that our water and our air could be safer and um, for our human bodies, especially for those who have health disparities already, especially for mothers and pregnant people and children. And so that was where I started getting involved with environmental issues. Around that same time, fracking was really starting to take off in Pennsylvania. And so I became involved with interfaith efforts to resist fracking in Pennsylvania. And this was a very difficult struggle because the fracking industry is still going strong in Pennsylvania and is still destroying air, water, land, and communities. One of the efforts I was involved in was in Riverdale. It was near Williamsport, Pennsylvania, where they were trying to put in a water withdrawal plant for the fracking industry. And they were evicting these low-income residents in order to put in this water withdrawal plant to suck out millions of gallons of water from the Susquehanna River and use it for fracking. And so we tried to work with this community to protect them, and we were not successful. They were evicted, and it was just a horrible, horrible situation of the industry taking advantage of these low income, low power residents. Another effort that I was involved in actually was successful, and this was a community organizing effort to stop a proposed tire incinerator in right near where my church was. And we actually worked with all kinds of different constituencies, and we were successful. The tire burner was defeated, so we were really happy about that. Here you can see that I was working with Jewish and Muslim people of faith. We were in Harrisburg for anti-fracking rally back in 2016, trying to make the case that we needed to put what we called a moratorium on fracking because of the way that it affects public health. And then right after that, I was hired here at Lexington Theological Seminary, and I teach preaching and worship here. So this is a really interesting place to be involved in environmental work. There are a lot of similarities between Kentucky and Pennsylvania in terms of extractive industries. In terms of Lexington Theological Seminary, we are a Disciples of Christ based seminary, but we have students from all different denominations, and we're primarily online. So our students come to us from all over the country, and they, before COVID, they would come to us for intensives in January and June. The last 2 years, it's been completely online. But it makes for a very rich learning environment. And I'll be, like I said, I'll talk a little bit later about the ways in which we help our students think about the intersections between faith and climate change and environmental justice and political issues. Another effort that I was involved in early on when I first moved here to Lexington was with the Poor People's Campaign. And they are doing incredible work to try to protect communities from environmental um, devastation. And so this was one of the rallies that we went to in Frankfurt, and Dr. William Barber was there, and you can see a great cross section of Kentucky residents there to be able to call on our local government to protect water and air and land. One of the ways in which I became acquainted specifically with the way Muslims think about environmental issues was with my connection with Huda Alkoff, who is the director of Wisconsin Green Muslims. So I don't know if any of you are aware that that this organization exists, but they're very much intent on showing the ways in which Islam is actually a very green religion. And so I got to be a speaker at Hartford Seminary, and I met Huda Alkoff there. And she just did an incredible presentation, which really helped me understand the ways in which Christianity and Islam find a common ground, common water, common air, and really made some excellent connections there. So when I worked with my colleague, Margaret Bullitt Jonas, to pull together our edited volume called Rooted and Rising: Voices of Courage in a Time of Climate Crisis, we invited Huda to write one of the chapters. So this book, which I really recommend to this group, the Christian Muslim Dialogue Group, to think about possibly doing a discussion about, it's 21 essays by religious environmental activists. So we have Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Unitarian, uh, 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 we have Black, white, Latine, we have indigenous, we have gay, straight, um, males, females. We have a great cross section of people who talk about how they're finding the inspiration to do this work in the face of what I call the dark night of the green soul. Environmental activists have been doing this work for a long time, and things are not getting better. In many ways, they're getting worse. And so how do we sustain ourselves in the midst of this? So the book has is divided into 7 sections, and each of them has study questions, great for small group discussions, spiritual practices, and for me as a preacher, there's great ideas for sermon themes and illustrations. So I want to talk a little bit about Huda's chapter that she entitled Connecting Faith, Environmental Justice, and Sustainability from an Islamic Reflection. So I just want to share with you a couple things that she shares that I think would be really interesting for this group to know. She says that it is a duty and obligation for Muslims to care for earth, our common home. God states in the Quran, the holy book for Muslims, it is God who has made you viceroys on earth. She points out that the earth is mentioned more than 450 times in the Quran, and that there are approximately 1,500 environmental messages in the Quran and the Hadith that guide Muslims toward care for all God's creatures and for sacred gifts and natural resources such as water, air, food, and light and land. And then there's just the Quran's chapter titles are just a beautiful array of God's creations. So bees, ants, stars, dawn, sun, moon, night. So the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, really drew on God's creation as manifestation of God's glory, and pointed out the ethical obligation of humans to care for it in all ways. And there are many stories and signs and lessons that relate to the natural world, like be like the tree or be like a bee, as some of the lessons in Islamic teachings. So one of the ways in which I have found great interfaith connections is through organizations that are intentionally drawing people together across religious lines in order to find common bonds for doing environmental activism. One is called Blessed Tomorrow, and it is an organization that's part of Eco-America, and they are looking at ways to equip congregations to put their faith into action with environmental issues. Another one is Green Faith, and they actually have, well, both Blessed Tomorrow and Green Faith have programs to help green houses of worship. Another one is Interfaith Power and Light. This is a national organization that has local, and or I should say state chapters. So we actually have a Kentucky Interfaith Power and Light. And I know they would be thrilled to have um, people from the Muslim faith join them in these efforts, looking at how we can advocate for, say, solar power in Kentucky, and environmental regulations to protect people in eastern Kentucky who have been devastated from the floods and by other environmental issues from mountaintop removal and from the mining. Another organization actually that Addison pointed out to me is called Deep Green Faith, and they're based, I think it's in Louisville, but I'm not exactly sure. But that is another organization right here in Kentucky that's doing fantastic work. So let me pause there and see what questions have come up just from this initial overview of the ways in which Christians and Muslims and other people of faith engage in environmental issues.
Given that we have these resources in the ground below us, is it possible? Have you heard of ways of extracting these resources responsibly and mindfully?
Well, I'll be very frank, no. The problem with fossil fuels is that there's many problems. First of all, one of the things to recognize is that the way in which the Earth has captured the carbon from previous millennia of carbon-based life forms and safely kept them beneath the surface so that the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide on the surface is enabled to be in balance is a beautiful, beautiful thing. So when we disrupt that cycle by burning the fossil fuels, it adds carbon dioxide and other global warming gases to the atmosphere in a way that tips the balance. And we're seeing the effects in all kinds of ways, from the melting of the ice caps, from the acidification of the oceans, and the rising of sea levels, catastrophic storms, wildfires, alternating floods and droughts. These are all symptoms of a climate system that is out of balance. And so one of the things that we need to do is to move away from fossil fuels and to sustainable forms of energy, such as solar and wind and geothermal and wave technology. And actually what we're finding is that the means for producing and the battery technology is actually increasing to the point where it's cheaper now to, when you're doing new energy projects, it's cheaper to do sustainable energy than to go with methane gas or coal or oil. So we're moving in the right direction. The question is about how fast we're getting it done. The other thing I'll say, and Carol, I see your hand, I'll get to you in just a second, is that from cradle to grave, the fossil fuel extraction process is damaging. So I'll just talk about fracking since I'm really familiar with that. So in order to frack, they have to drill down like a mile beneath the Earth's surface. They have to clear cut areas of whatever was there before. So you're disrupting habitat on the surface. When you drill down into the Earth's surface, they have to put down explosives underneath the surface to fracture. That's where fracking comes from. They fracture the shale that contains the methane, and then they have to inject slick water. So it's water that is filled with all kinds of chemicals to kill anything that could clog up the pipes. And then that water that's coming up back from the surface contains all kinds of chemicals and heavy metals that are poisonous, and they do runoff into streams and into the water table. The fractures go into the groundwater, and so methane leaks into people's wells, and they can actually light their water on fire because of the gas in the water. So they can't drink it, and they can't bathe in it, and they just can't consume it. And then they have to burn off the methane. And methane is actually a more potent form of greenhouse gas, even than carbon dioxide in the short term. So carbon dioxide lasts a long time in the atmosphere, so that's a problem. But methane is more potent in the 20-year time period, which is when we need to be drawing down, not ramping up. And then you've got problems with the pipelines and the transportation of fracking. And then you've got all kinds of problems with the manufacturing plants that turn some of the gas into plastics. And you got gas leaks from beginning to end. So it's just a really harmful practice all the way around. Carol, go ahead, please.
Good morning. Thank you for taking my question. Absolutely, everything that you just said is incredibly important, and moving away from fossil fuels is incredibly important. How can I convince folks who think so diametrically different? They bemoan the fact that um, President Biden almost immediately put a stop to some pipelines. How can I get them to see just how damaging this is without arguing? They don't they don't see things politically the same way. And I am sick to death of fighting. I don't think there is a human conflict that has ever ended. I am sick to death of fighting. And yet this is so very important. I feel like I cannot be silent.
Mm. Carol, you're pointing out a really important dynamic that we need to address in this country and really globally. This, what you're pointing out, is something that we're dealing with, which is that even when people see the reality of what's happening, they're denying it, or they are gaslighting others about whether or not it's true that it's happening. And this is driven by a number of factors. One is a profit motive. So you're not going to convince somebody that there is a problem if they are actually benefiting from the problem financially. So, and then there are some who, unfortunately, environmental issues, which were not political, or I should say politicized, the way they are now. Like, 20 years ago, you actually had Democrats and Republicans on the same page, recognizing that, yeah, we need to do something about this, which is why we got some of the environmental regulation, the Safe Water Act, the Safe Streams, that, we had some bipartisan support, but it has become politicized
I know.
by those who are benefiting from the political divides. So I would suggest that there are some people who are, like you said, diametrically opposed, and we're not going to convince them because they're just not. I mean, it's not worth wasting the time on them. But there are some people who just don't know. They literally are ignorant, and I don't mean in an insulting way, like they're not aware of the connections. So education is really important, helping people understand what the connections are. So for the vast majority in the middle, to help them understand so that they are willing to vote and support policies and politicians who will move forward on this, that's where we really need to concentrate our efforts. The other thing that we need to do is to network with people who are already doing this work, which is why organizations like Blessed Tomorrow and Interfaith Power and Light, like they're already understanding, like, here's the legislation that's coming up. And the more people that are supporting them in their efforts, the more effective they can be. So join with the people who are already doing the work, educate the people, the vast majority who are not quite understanding yet, and those who are diametrically opposed, we need to resist their efforts, but we're not going to be able to change their minds because there's too much at stake for them in retaining the status quo. Yeah, Addison, you're bringing up a point that has been long repeated by those who are opposed to sustainable energy, that it's not reliable. The sun doesn't shine all the time and the wind doesn't always blow. Fortunately, we're moving into a time when technology is catching up in terms of storage capability. So they're creating like batteries, and I don't mean like AA batteries. I'm talking about huge storage batteries to be able to, like, when the sun does shine, you store this in the battery so that it can be used in the grid in the long term. So technology is catching up in order for there to be a more consistent a more consistent source of energy. The other thing that I want to point out is that actually fossil fuels are less reliable than we've been led to believe. So with fracking, for example, once you frack a well, once it's done, it's done. Like, you can't go back and get anything else out of it. Like, they have to frack it for, like, you know, consistently 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And but once the gas is gone, it's gone. So that is actually not reliable. Once the oil is gone, it's gone. And you'll have some people that'll say, well, then we just need to dig deeper or go other places, or go into the ocean or go underneath the icebergs or whatever. But then you're doing more disruption. So what we want to do is learn from the plants about how to produce energy in a sustainable way. Learn from the wind, learn from the waves. They are producing energy, and the more science and research that we can do to learn from them, so that we are not destroying habitats and human health, the better off we'll be. So let me go back to my PowerPoint here, and let me go on to the next section, which I want to share with you some of the research that I've been doing on the state of green preaching. So somebody had asked a question about resources. So how do we educate people? Well, as a homiletician, and a homiletician is somebody who studies the art of preaching and teaches it. So I'm a homiletician, and I'm very interested in how faith leaders can communicate about environmental issues to their congregations in order to inspire them and activate their willingness to engage in the public square and on environmental issues. So I did a survey back in 2017 about how pastors are dealing with controversial issues in their sermons. And what I found was actually pretty sad. I gave them a list of like 38 topics, and I asked, what did you address in 2016? And I found that environmental issues were among the lowest ranked topics that they addressed in their sermons in 2016. It just was not a priority for them. So I call this suffering from a vitamin C, as in creation deficiency. I am coming from the what I want to make the case that congregations need to be nourished by the nutrient and vitamin rich theological and biblical themes about God's creation in order to live out their faith by protecting and preserving this planet. So I like to imagine a forest of preaching. So, whether it's an imam or it's a rabbi or it's a priest, that in congregations all across the world, they're drawing deeply from the soil of biblical eco-exegesis. So what do I mean by that? Exegesis is how to interpret texts. So thinking about how does the text give us wisdom for protecting creation, the ecology. So biblical eco-exegesis and eco-theology. So how do we understand theologically the relationship between God and creation and humanity, so that over time people are starting to change their lifestyles and our cultures, and that we can sustain a long-term vision of God's justice for creation through our hearts, minds, and hands. So that's what I'm advocating for in my work. Now, why does this matter? Why does preaching about environmental issues matter? Well, they've been doing some studies about this. So, PRRI did a study where they found that Americans who have clergy that speak at least occasionally about climate change are more likely to believe it exists than Americans who tend not to hear about climate change in their church. Additionally, more than 6 in 10 Americans who report hearing about climate change from their clergy leader, at least occasionally, are very or somewhat concerned with climate change, compared with approximately 4 in 10 whose pastors rarely or never talk about climate change. So what does this tell us? It means parishioners are listening. Now, you know what Carol was saying, there might be people who are resistant to this message, but at least they are listening. If they know that their pastor is trying to make the case, this connection, and make this is a matter of our biblical, moral, ethical obligation, then they may argue against that. But the Bible is very clear that we are to be caretakers of creation, and that we are to protect and preserve what God has made. Everything from Genesis all the way to Revelation. I'm talking about the Christian and Hebrew scriptures. All the way through, you can find an eco-ethic about land, water, and how that is connected to human communities. Now, here's the interesting thing. I mentioned earlier Eco-America. Well, they've been doing studies about Americans' attitudes about climate change as well. And they found just last year that 78% of Americans are more concerned about climate change as a result of severe weather, compared with only 22%. So this tells us that what people are seeing literally in their own backyards, and they're starting to make it like, this is not normal, this is not right, it can't be explained away of, well, these are just natural earth cycles. No, this is not right. There's something wrong with the body of earth. It is sick. So here's the interesting thing. I did a survey, a follow-up survey in 2021, so just last year, and I gave them I gave pastors a list of issues again. And look at this: environment, climate change, pollution, extinction, environmental issues came in the top 10. It was number 6 on the list. That's a huge jump. And this shows us that environmental issues are, yes, still politicized, but because it's becoming so apparent that we need to talk about this, that pastors are doing so. The bad news is, if you look over on the percentage side, little less than half are talking about it in their sermons. I want to make the case that all pastors need to talk about this. So we need to be doing more work in theological education to equip pastors to do this. So one of the things that I do in my work is to help seminarians and preachers understand how to root their preaching in scripture and theology. So just basically making the case that creation care is part of our responsibility as Christians and establishing strong biblical and scriptural foundations. We can look at just Genesis chapters 1 and 2, where God creates it all, God calls it good. In chapter 2, God gives responsibility to humans to till and to keep the garden, okay? So our efforts to curb greenhouse gas emissions and to clean up pollution and establish environmental protection legislation ultimately help preserve the earth, which God has called good. So right there, that's foundational for our understanding of faith. I'm also working, as I said before, with a rabbi in Jerusalem. His name is Yonatan Nerel, and he is the co-editor of a 2-volume set called Eco-Bible, which is an ecological commentary on Genesis, Exodus, and then the second one is Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And there are lots of other resources out there. There's one called the Green Bible, which some of you might have heard of the Red Letter Bible, where all the words of Jesus are in red. Well, anything having to do with creation is in green font. It's really cool. And of course, like I said, Eco-Bible has Hebrew commentary on scripture. I'm Lutheran, so Lutherans Restoring Creation has a great website for worship resources and preaching resources. There's also one called Sustainable Preaching Website. So there's lots of resources out there to help preachers do this. So what I'm working on with Rabbi Yonatan is something called Eco Preacher 123. So in this monthly resource that we give to preachers and whoever else wants it, we give them an eco idea. So what's one idea that you want to encapsulate from looking at this piece of scripture from an ecological perspective? What are 2 eco questions to help your parishioners go deeper with this? And then what are 3 eco actions? So ideas for bringing this to your context and helping people put their faith into action. So this is, like I said, a monthly resource that it's free, and we send it out. We're trying to make this as easy for preachers as possible and accessible, but this can be used by Bible, people who are leading Bible studies or discussions about scripture. And I'll put a link into the chat if you'd like to see more of this. So we just started this last year, and it's really starting to gain traction.
I'm thinking in terms of the evangelical point of view, that Genesis tells us that man was put there to rule over the earth. That in Isaiah, I will create new heavens and a new earth. The idea that this earth is perhaps expendable or should be expendable, needs to be destroyed as a sign of the coming end times. So I guess, how does an evangelical point of view, biblical point of view, tie into eschatology, a fancy word for the end times?
Yeah, great question. So let me start with the idea that humans were put here to rule over or dominate the earth. So we get this idea originally from Genesis chapter 1, verse 28, where human beings are, given dominion over the earth. What we have to understand is some of the historical background for this passage. So this passage was originally written when the Hebrew people were in exile, and they were living under the Babylonians, who had a very different theology than the Hebrew people. So the Babylonians believed that the earth was created out of a war among the gods, and that one of the gods was killed, and out of the carcass of that dead god, the world was created, and out of the blood of that dead god, human beings were created. And the implicit message is that the only way we can exist is through conflict and violence and all or nothing victory over the people that you conquer. And you could see how that idea was um, motivating the Babylonians in the way they just completely decimated the temple of the Jews, and just exploited them and put them into slavery. So in the midst of this, the Jewish people are telling a different creation story. It's a story not of God creating out of violence, but creating out of words, right? God spoke the world into being. Let there be light, and there was light. It was an act of love and grace and self-giving. There is no violence in the creation story until we get to Cain and Abel. and that growing out of the sin of human beings not living within the means and the protections that God had put in place. The story of Genesis 3 of human beings wanting to take from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So human beings can go anywhere in the garden, and they're supposed, remember, they were vegetarians. They weren't eating meat. They were, I've given you all green plants for food. But they could not live within the limits that God set out to them as a protection to say this far and no further. And they gave in to the temptation to believe that they would become like God. That was the serpent's temptation. You'll become like God. And so we see this archetypal story then played out throughout the rest of the history, not just of the Jewish people, but humanity itself. What I want to say is, just because we can doesn't mean that we should. Yes, you can take the fruit, but that doesn't mean that you should. Yes, you can dig and frack and do all of these things, but that doesn't mean that you should. And so we're looking at what is the guiding ethical principles that will allow for the overall health of the web of life, not just for humans at the what is considered the apex. So one of the best books that I can recommend for people to move away from this hierarchical understanding of humans at the top is Robin Wall Kimmerer's book, Braiding Sweetgrass. And she's coming from an indigenous tradition, but she's also a scientist. And she tries to show how our foundational stories and our scientific knowledge can coexist in a way that human beings can live in harmony and sustaining with nature. So we have to tell stories that will lead to the flourishing of all, not to the richest and whitest and at the top. In terms of eschatology, this is another way in which Christian theology has really undergone what I would call theological malpractice. So there are some Christians that say, yeah, we actually have to destroy the earth in order for Jesus to come back. But that is a completely corrupt reading of Scripture. Remember, God says that it is good. And so when we talk about a new heaven and a new earth, it doesn't mean that, okay, we're going to throw away this one and the big daddy God in the sky is just going to come and, give us a new one. No, this is about a renewal of the hearts and minds of humanity. Paul's letter to the Romans says that all creation groans in anticipation for the revealing of the children of God. So all creation is waiting for humanity to wake up to the calling or vocation of being part of the web of life and taking care of it rather than destroying it. So this fulfillment is something that is in the scriptural story, but it's not about destroying. It is about living into the vocation that God has given us. I see Carol has a comment. Water is life. Of all the water here on Mother Earth, Gaia, that's the Greek word for earth. I have been taught that only 3% is potable, drinkable. Of that 3%, I've recently learned that 2/3 is frozen, although this is rapidly changing, right? This means that only 1% of all the water on the earth is available for sufficient for all God's earthly creatures that require it. Water will become the new liquid gold as climate change increases. Perhaps if I change the focus from protesting against, it would bridge the political divide if I focused on the limited yet completely sufficient water that all people require and keeping that water clean. So I'm going to tell a story about this, Carol, to illustrate your point. When I was a pastor at that first church I served in Media, this was a politically divided congregation. So we had everything from bright red Adam Smith capitalists to bright blue and green progressives, tree-hugging progressives, and everything in between politically. And this was back when Al Gore's film An Inconvenient Truth was released. Remember, he was the first to really, in a big way, try to draw attention to what was going on. And I started an ecology ministry in that congregation, and we wanted to show the film in our community and have a potluck and have a discussion about it. And there were some council members, very conservative council members, who voted to ban our showing of the film because they said it was too political. And this happened at a time I was sick and couldn't be at the meeting, so they did this like behind my back. So I went afterwards. I was furious, but I was like, okay, wait, I got to find a way to get done what I want to get done. So I said to this person, we've already advertised this. We've got a lot of people coming. What would it take for us to show this film? And he said, because we were bringing one of the Al Gore trained facilitators, and he said, I'll tell you what, if you let me bring one of my guys to debate your guy, your Al Gore guy, then we'll go ahead with it. And I was like, fine. So he paid to fly up a guy from Florida who was with the Heritage Foundation. And if you know, it's like a conservative think tank. So this created a huge, it was like a tempest in a teapot. And the good thing is we had more people at the film than we would have had without this controversy, because now all the conservative folks came because they wanted to see the Al Gore guy get demolished by the conservative debater after the film. So everybody, we had a potluck, the room was packed, we watched the film, and then, the two guys went at it, and the Al Gore guy said, look, the reason I'm doing this work, I don't get paid. I'm doing this because I care about my children and my grandchildren being able to live in a world that is safe and healthy and flourishing. And the Heritage Foundation guy, all he talked about was the money. Money, 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 money. It was all about the economy. There was no soul there was just no depth to it. And it became very apparent what was at stake. It's money versus love. That's what it was about. So at the end of this, but here's where it gets down to the water, right? So at the end of this, the group of conservative council members came up to me and they said, we hated the film, but there was one point that we could agree on, and that was that water is going to become a very scarce commodity in the years ahead, and we need to do everything that we can to protect clean water. So they said, Pastor Schade, if you want to preach about clean water, we will not give you any pushback about that. I was like, great. So the next time I preached on the baptism of Jesus, I talked about the necessity of having clean water in which to baptize people and, protecting that. So we didn't find common ground, but we found common water. So that's just one little story to illustrate, Carol, that's one way we can find a way to connect across political divides. I see a question from Anne in the chat. She's asking, so should capitalism be constrained by morality, or should capitalism be changed to something else that recognizes a global community's needs of food, water, and natural environment? Wow. So that's the political third rail in all of this. And I'll tell you why it's a political third rail. It's a great question, Anne. So in my research, not only have I been talking with preachers about what topics they're preaching on or don't want to preach on, I've also been surveying congregations. And I've done some research projects through a Wabash grant and also with the United Methodist Church. And we give surveys to congregations before we teach their pastors how to engage in something I call deliberative dialogue, which I told you all about last time I was here 3 years ago. So in this survey, we gave the parishioners a list of words, and we asked them to indicate which of these words is too political to hear in a sermon. And among the words were things like guns and climate change and Black Lives Matter, right? And so when we gave them that list, do you know what the number one word was that they said was too political? The number one word was capitalism. Capitalism. More than guns. More than guns. So what this tells me as a theologian is, to me, and I should have brought this slide. I don't have it. I have it in another presentation. But that to me, that sort of snapshot is what I would say are the idols of our age. This is a picture of idolatry. So the things that we can't talk about are the idols which refuse to be interrogated. So the idol of capitalism does not want a theological or biblical light shined on it, or it will be critiqued, and we'll start asking questions that you are asking, Anne, like, should we constrain capitalism with morality? Or do we need to go to a completely different kind of economic system that does not want to commodify food, water, and natural environment, but actually that our economic system serves the earth rather than earth serving the economic system? That is a huge question that I don't have time to deal with in this presentation, but I would encourage this group to grapple with that question in your congregations as much as you can, knowing that there will be pushback because capitalism has been fused with patriotism. It has been fused with Christianity in the form of the prosperity gospel. Some of you may have heard of that. So when you fuse economics with religion, it is very difficult to separate them. And there are a lot of people who can see only a threat to their power by asking these questions. And so they'll do anything to shut down that conversation. So I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint and talk to you a little bit more about the work that I've been doing at the seminary, trying to help our students understand the connections between faith and politics and environment. So the course that I teach is called Who is My Neighbor in Appalachia. And it's an immersion course. Remember I said we're an online seminary, but for this course, it's actually a hybrid. So they have to do readings ahead of time, but then we bring them here and we go to Eastern Kentucky and we go to places like Hazard and Lynch and Whitesburg to see Apple Shop, so that students can, and we go into the forests and we take walks and we immerse ourselves in this. So we did this originally back in 2019. COVID hit, we couldn't do anything. This year we did it again. We were able to get it in. And I want to show you what some of our students have been thinking about. So a little bit about this program that I work with. So it's called AMERC, and it stands for Appalachian Ministries Education and Resource Center. And they try to help seminarians think about what it's like to do ministry in Appalachia, thinking about the culture, thinking about the theological, spiritual, social, and economic aspects. And especially for me, I'm looking at the environmental aspects of Appalachia. So I got a grant and we took our students down to Appalachia and we talked with lots of people. And we ask this fundamental question: what is it like to be you in this place? What is it like to be you in this place? We asked that question of people who still mine people who are still in the vocation of mining. We asked that question of the trees in our walks in nature. We asked that question of students who talked with us. We asked that question of pastors. We asked that question over and over to try to listen deeply to the experience of what it means to live in this place. And I encourage you to think of that question when you are trying to find common ground or trying to build bridges across divides. What is it like to be you in this place? And then the question, who is my neighbor, actually comes from a parable in one of the Gospels, in the Gospel of Luke, about the Good Samaritan. And in this parable, Jesus tells the story of a man who walks down a road and is beaten up by robbers, and he's stripped, and all his money's taken away, and he's left by the side of the road, and a priest comes by and walks on the other side, doesn't help him, and then a Levite comes by, so these are supposed to be like two very holy people, walks on the other side of the road, ignores him, and then a Samaritan, who is somebody that the Jews would have looked on with fear and despise and just hatred. Whoops, and go back. That is the person who helps the man by the side of the road. So I make the case that we need to think about who our neighbor is, not just our human neighbors, but also our environmental neighbors. And I want my students and all people to think about who is my neighbor in terms of the trees and the forests and the mountains and the watersheds and the ecosystems. And in this place of Appalachia, our neighbors, our human neighbors, who have often forgotten, maligned, mocked, dismissed, and exploited. So I had the students do projects where they had to create a Who is my neighbor map. And they had to take this back to their congregations and talk about what they learned. And then they had to preach a sermon about it. Some of them did like actual posters, which you can see here. Some of them, you can see the web behind there. So she talked about the web of life and the different people that she met on this trip. There's another part of that web. This person did a diagram to talk about the neighbors that he encountered. And then he showed some pictures of what that looks like, to think about the trees and the birds and the fish and the animals, as well as the people who are his neighbors. Here's another student who again has that web in the background and the interconnectedness of all of the people and the places that we went. And the last thing I want to leave you with is a quote that we heard from a person named May Humiston, who is a local community developer in the area. And she says this, she says, Appalachia doesn't need saving, it needs solidarity. Isn't that beautiful? Appalachia doesn't need saving, it needs solidarity. Capitalism is a human-made system, and humans created it, humans can change it. It's not the only exploitative system. Remember too that in the time when the prophets were writing, for the prophets of Micah and Jeremiah and Isaiah, that was also an exploitative system. It didn't start out that way. Remember, there was the idea of Jubilee and Sabbath, which was originally conceived to help restore the balance of justice and rest for people and for the environment. And it was often ignored by the leaders. And so the prophets would have to call the leaders to account and make, try to show, like, if you keep following this trajectory where you are exploiting people, exploiting the earth, this is what's going to happen. And in fact, Micah, I'm actually doing a sermon on Micah coming up for a different situation. And Micah, and actually other prophets do this too, calls on heaven and earth as witnesses, like in a courtroom, of the sins of human beings. So the biblical writers give creation agency and voice. They give agency and voice for creation to worship God. Fellow worshipers, the trees clap their hands. Jesus says that, on Palm Sunday, or we talk about Jesus making the procession to Jerusalem, and all of his followers are making a ruckus, and the religious leaders say, hey, you need to shut them up. And he says, if these were silent, the stones themselves would cry out. So that, all of creation participates in this.
Leah?
Yes.
This is David and Betty Lawless. I just want to thank you again. I've heard you twice now, and I think this kind of presentation you're making is so important. And I just appreciate Lexington Theological Seminary bringing you to our community. And I particularly want to ask you to continue that kind of work in Appalachia with the kind of things you're taking to that kind of connection to that part of where I've spent a lot of my time working is so very important. So I really want to appreciate you're doing that kind of work. And thank you again for these presentations.
Oh, you're very welcome, David. Thanks for that feedback. I have to say that I myself have been as much a student as my own students have been. I believed a lot of the stereotypes about people living in Appalachia because of the way the media portrays them. And it took my own sort of conversion experience, like the scales having to fall from my eyes, to realize just what there's no monolithic way to think about Appalachia. There is no one way to think about the people who are there. I learned, like one of my students said, I can't believe there are Black people in Appalachia. Like, she's not from this area of the country at all, but like the idea is like these are poor white folks, uneducated, and there's this media portrayal like Beverly Hillbillies kind of thing, right? But one of the places we take them to is an African American church in Hazard, and the pastor tells us about the history of blacks coming to Appalachia. A lot of slaves came to this area after the emancipation, looking for work, and so there are people who go back generations, people of African descent living in the area. There were people like from all over the world that came to Appalachia for to work the mines, and in many ways, again, were exploited and taken advantage of, but they developed a sense of pride that they were creating the energy for this country. I think that they were severely taken advantage of, and to this day, people who get black lung, they are often left high and dry by their companies and by our government, and it's terrible the way they have been exploited, but they're incredibly resourceful. And you look at the way that they are trying to be resilient after the flooding, and the way really this whole state has tried to come together for the most part. I mean, there are some politicians that have not really helped at all, and some people who have not helped at all, and sort of victim blaming. But lots of people going down to help and gathering up supplies and just doing whatever we can to help these people. It's incredible. So I myself have had to be changed and have my own eyes opened through this. So it's been a blessing to me as well.
We tend to take our idea of stewardship of the land, of all creation. Are we being stewards of something we don't value?
So steward is actually a problematic word for some Christian eco-theologians. The idea that stewards are something, or people who are in charge of something else. And it still perpetuates this notion that human beings are over and above creation. And and that is certainly one way to interpret the text. That is one way to interpret text. I'm not saying that's an invalid way, but there's another thing to notice is that in Genesis 2:15, we get a different way to think about the relationship between humans and the earth. So the verbs, the Hebrew verbs, where it says that God put them in the garden to till and to keep, are about restraint. They are about learning. They are about submitting, about being under under the tutelage almost of earth rather than dominating earth. So there are two different writers of within Genesis. There's the priestly and there's the Yahwist writer. That's what biblical scholars call them. And both stories are there. So we have to decide how we want to, what interpretation is going to best exemplify who we understand God to be. So when we look, and then when we pair that with, say, Philippians chapter 2, where Jesus canonically empties himself and takes on flesh and blood, not being above humanity, but really taking this on, we see a very different notion of what it means to be in solidarity with, right? Not just I'm over you and you'll do what I say. So I just want to point out that there are some eco-theologians that don't agree with the idea of stewardship. On the other hand, here's the thing with stewards. And if you look at Jesus's parables, we know that stewards were entrusted with the responsibility to take care of whatever the owner had entrusted to them, and they were accountable for it. They had to answer for what they did with it. So in that sense, I like the idea of stewardship, because some people say, well, God gave us the earth as a gift. Okay, but a gift means that, like, if I give you a gift, I have no control over it anymore. That you can do with it what you want. But that's not what the biblical story really tells us. It's that we are entrusted with this for a certain period of time, and we're going to have to answer for what how we handled that which was entrusted to us. And so, if we are not stewarding it the way God intended, then there are consequences for that. And we're actually living out those consequences right now. When we can't drink the water, when there are plastics, microplastics now in our bloodstream that are causing cancers and all kinds of health problems, when we're going into forests that should have been left alone and pulling out all kinds of exotic animals, and they're stressed and they're shedding weird diseases like coronavirus that jump the animal human barrier. Now we're dealing with the consequences of that. So there's this interconnectedness that we need to understand, that there are some things that we need to respect and protect, and we need to hold back instead of always pushing all the time. Great question, Addison. Thanks for that.
This certainly is an issue that crosses faiths. It is and shouldn't be, I think, political, except for the economic impact, that the changes in the needed changes are going to have that kind of consequence, which are going to take jobs away. It's going to take food off the table, perhaps, for the people who actually are working the jobs. I think a future consideration might be something along the lines of broadening our imaginations. What are alternatives to capitalism and socialism and communism? That will be a tough one, but that would be an exciting conversation to have. And
yeah, a couple of things I want to say in response to that. First of all, when we took our group to Eastern Kentucky, we went to a place called Portal 31 in Lynch, Kentucky, which was one of the company mining towns. So US Steel went in there and literally built a town where there had been no town before. And they provided all the housing and, like, the schools, the house, like, everything was there. And they mined the coal in order to for the steel industry. And the Portal 31 closed, I think, in like 1960s. So, it just came to the point where, again, like, it was done. They did all they could do. And but the Portal 31 is now an historic mine, and you can take tours through it, and it's fascinating. And it is just absolutely, like, you go into the mine, you're on the rail car, you see the history of, like, what happened. It's an incredible tour. I highly recommend it. But one of the things that one of our students asked our guide, who is a coal miner, she said, so, and this was back when Trump was president, and she said, I hear Trump making promises that we're going to bring coal back, we're going to bring the jobs back. And this was a coal miner telling us this. He said, these jobs aren't coming back. And here's why. He said, it used to take hundreds, thousands of men to mine these seams. But over time, the machinery that was developed reduced the number of men that were needed. And they showed us this huge mechanism. I mean, like filling an entire room of these giant, like, claw things that just went through the rock, where it used to take one guy with a pick, right? He said what used to take 100 guys takes two, one to run the machine and one to fix it if it breaks. These jobs aren't coming back, even if we wanted them to. He's like, we have to find other ways to employ people because it's just not going to happen. So one of the things that May Humiston, who I mentioned in the presentation, who's a community organizer, she suggested that, or has actually shown that one of the things that they're talking about in these communities are ways to provide jobs that people can be proud of and don't destroy the environment. So one of them is through ecotourism, and that's like becoming a really huge thing. People, going rock climbing, going, visiting the state parks, doing bike trails and that sort of thing, and then all of the restaurants and everything that's needed in the hotels to support that. The other thing I thought was really interesting, one of the things we learned about the history of Appalachia prior to the extraction of the timber industry. Okay, so I'm talking like early settler kind of thing. Because of the geography of the land, where it's hard to get from one area to another. I mean, you got to go over the mountains and that sort of thing. And so there was much more of a barter economy in those communities where people didn't exchange money, they exchanged goods and services among them and between them in a much more healthy and sustainable way. And so there are people in those communities who are thinking about, is it possible for us to restore a barter economy instead of a commodity, an economy based on the exchange of money? I don't know where that's going to go, but that's really intriguing for me, not just in Appalachia, but in a broader sense. Like, can we return to, I make something for you, you make something for me. What are your gifts? What can you make that we can exchange? What are services that I can give that you can't do, that I can, we can exchange? That really fascinates me, and I'd love to see some intentional thinking and experimenting with that.
This is Ollie. Add to the Lynch. I heard you mention Lynch, Kentucky,
Yes.
right? Yeah. So I have a good friend that's from Lynch. So I visited there a couple of times and done the tour. And so I think that you were talking about Blacks in Appalachia. A lot of those families that are still there are descendants of coal miners who were recruited from small towns in Alabama and Georgia, which is where my friend came from. Also, you were talking about past speakers. We've had someone from the Interfaith Power and Light.
Oh, good.
On a panel with Dr. Iksan Bagby at Masjid Bilal, where Dr. Iksan talked about the Islamic approach to environmental issues. And then the person from Interfaith Power and Light shared his perspective on that organization. So
beautiful.
And I see in the chat that Addison has mentioned Nancy Sleeth, who we had speak in 2014, and Dr. John Rausch, who's doing a lot of work in Appalachia. We've had them speak.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I don't know if you all are aware, sadly, Father John Rausch passed away. And he's actually the one that gave us the question, what is it like to be you in this place? Like, that was his question to us. And we are deeply, deeply mourning his loss. He was just such an incredible advocate for the people and the environment in Appalachia. So thank you for remembering him.
I would like to speak to that as well. Can you hear me?
Yes, Carolyn, thank you, please.
Okay, this brings to my mind that we actually took a group of CMD members, attenders, to Appalachia under the leadership of Dr. Rausch, Reverend Rausch. and spent a day there visiting agencies that he thought were helpful in the area, visiting strip mined area, talking about that. Well, spending a whole day just overseeing what this so-called Eastern Kentucky Appalachia was. And I can't remember how many went, but I know that all of us were deeply moved by what we saw and did, and gave us a firsthand look at things that we had heard about but didn't know. So that was about 5 years ago. If I remember, Ollie might be able to remember exactly when that was.
Carolyn, I'm so glad to hear that. That is beautiful. One of the gifts that Father Rausch had was, first of all, he was a great networker. Like, he knew the people to talk to, the places to go, and he also had a gift of liturgy, right? So he would do I don't know if you all did this with him, but he had liturgies where he would go with people to areas that had been strip mined or mountaintop removal, and they would scatter seeds, wildflower seeds, and have a
Oh, wow.
liturgy about that.
Oh, what a nice idea.
Yeah, and there was actually a documentary made about that, and what it was like for people to stand in these places that were just so desolate. I mean, they were like moonscapes, and but in trust, in faith, and in God's healing of the earth, scattering those seeds, and apparently he came back. He would come back to these places year after year, and some of them had taken root,
Oh,
and so what we know about Earth is that it is incredibly resilient when we leave it alone. I think some of you remember during COVID when everything shut down, and we saw cities that had been smog filled. People were able to see the blue sky in ways that they couldn't before. Animals were appearing in places where they hadn't been before. Birds. It was like Earth just like, oh, okay, well, if you give us room to be, and allow us to coexist with you, we can come back. We can do this. So there are a lot of people, there are a lot of organizations that are trying to restore the natural lands. Another organization I want to tell you all about is called Kentucky Natural Lands Trust, and they do incredible work. They are trying to preserve a corridor of of areas in Kentucky and Tennessee, and I'm trying to think where else, like a whole part of the Southern Appalachian corridor, by purchasing privately owned land. And yeah, thank you, Addison, for putting that into the chat, and creating climate safe zones, because animals are going to need higher elevations as the climate is warming. So animals that need cooler climates, they need to be able to migrate vertically as well as horizontally. And so KNLT is doing amazing work putting together this corridor right here in Kentucky. So so I would encourage any of you to learn about their work and support their work as well. We don't think beyond the immediate profit motive. We were very short term in our thinking. And again, if we return to our indigenous siblings who think about seventh generation, how is this going to affect the seventh generation? And take that seriously. That is something I think that could help to modify and change the decisions that we make. but that's gonna, I mean, and here's the thing, that's why houses of worship and people of faith are so important. We have the spiritual and the scriptural and the theological resources to frame this ethically and morally for people. You know, the civil rights movement in this country would not have happened without the churches and the synagogues. And in the climate movement today, we're seeing more and more people of faith join it. But like, we're the sleeping giant. If we can activate denominations and you know, mosques and synagogues and churches to do this work in a concerted and organized way, that will have a multiplying effect on the good work that environmentalists are trying to do.
How do you feel about the current committee, group, agencies that are working to revitalize Eastern Kentucky, Appalachia, through capitalism partly, but also through eco-tourism and so forth, things like that? What is your outlook on the future in this regard?
Yeah, I again, there are positives, but there are also downsides to this. So on the one hand, yes, we want ecotourism in these places so that people, you know, as Richard Louv said in his book about children and the environment, children will not save what they do not love. So we have to help people fall in love with nature again. And so giving them opportunities to do this is great. However, I know like there's that project to try to build a resort in the
In the gorge.
which I hyperventilate a little bit about that. I'm like, no, that's not the place for this. And it feels very much like you know, only the rich will be able to afford this. And then it becomes, once again, it's not about the commons anymore. It's about making an elite playground for the wealthy. So we have to, what are the underlying principles? And if we're not thinking about the commons, and if we're only thinking about preserving the comfort and pleasure of those who can afford it, then our values are not going to align with what is actually needed.
What is your opinion of the huge greenhouses that are being constructed? I think there's one in Moorhead, but are to eventually employ a lot of people that are currently the big rage. The scene is a salvation.
Greenhouses, or do you mean the solar panels?
No, I mean the greenhouses that have been built to grow
Tomatoes.
You know what? That's new to me. I will have to do some reading and research about that. I'm surprised I don't know about it. I'm glad you brought it to my attention.
They're growing tomato things for local use, tomatoes, lettuces, things like that. And they're huge. I mean, the size of football fields, the greenhouses, and they employ many people. I shouldn't say it. I think if there's one now, but maybe there's intended to be many.
It's called App Harvest, and the first one was in Moorhead, but now they're building two others, one near Berea. And Leah, you really need to Google App Harvest and take a look at that.
Is it AG Harvest? Is that what?
Yeah, like Appalachia Harvest.
Oh, App Harvest. Okay, I will definitely look into that. I will just say, and this is an uninformed response because I don't know what I'm talking about, but my initial, so I have two thoughts. First of all, on the one hand, yay, we're growing local food. Great, that's wonderful. On the other hand, I would be concerned about like there was already a natural habitat there. And so replacing it with, which is essentially, it sounds like monoculture, is problematic. I'm much more interested in urban vertical gardening, where we reclaim abandoned urban spaces and create vertical gardens that can be provide local produce for urban centers, so that we move away from, you know, the city versus the rural. That's a huge problem in this country, this divide. I'd love to see more of the creation brought into our urban spaces, and learning how to do urban forestry, urban agriculture, and allowing these spaces in that are, you know, that have not had human hands on them as much. Let them be, let them grow into the forest that they were originally, or into the prairies, like if you're up in northern Illinois, or, you know, let the land do what the land can do. Land that is able to manage itself with light help from humans is some of the best carbon sequestration on Earth, and we need more carbon sequestration. So, so that would be my initial thoughts on that, without having learned too much about it. There are always going to be benefits and downsides. And what I would encourage any community before deciding to do something, and this goes back to my purple zone stuff, right? That we need to have more community conversations and deliberative dialogue about something before we just go ahead and do it. We need to have more people at the table making decisions who can give informed, educated responses to, all right, what are the economic benefits, but what are some of the downsides? What are the long-term consequences that might come of this? And weigh those so that we can make an informed decision that the entire community has had a chance to have a say in. So restoring democracy is really important in all of this. And so one of the last things that I want to leave you all with is just the importance of voting and participating in the democratic process, and, you know, volunteering to help with voting, getting voter registration, supporting candidates who share your values. All of that is important. Getting other people to vote. Democracy, a healthy ecosystem relies on a healthy democracy. And so, knowing with the midterms coming up, I would encourage all of you to really be active civil participants. And thank you all very much again for the invitation. This is such a vibrant and robust group. It's so necessary for these cross-religious conversations to happen. This is the mustard seed work that Jesus was talking about. This is the yeast in the dough. This is the light on the hill. You all are doing the work. And I'm grateful that you've committed to this and you've been part of it for more than 2 decades now. It is these kinds of conversations that will help heal our society and help heal the earth. So thank you very much for inviting me to be a part of it today.